want to talk to you a little bit about user-generated content. I'm going to tell you 3 stories on the way to one argument that's going to tell you a little bit about how we open user-generated content up for business. So here's the first story. 1906, this man, John Philip Sousa, traveled to this place, the United States capital, to talk about this technology, what he called the, quote, talking machines. Sousa was not a fan of the talking machines. This is what he had to say. These talking machines are going to ruin artistic development of music in this country. When I was a boy, in front of every house in the summer evenings, you would find young people together singing the songs of the day or the old songs. Today, you hear these infernal machines going night and day. We will not have a vocal cord left, Sousa said. The vocal cords will be eliminated by a process of evolution, as was the tale of man when he came from the ape. Now, this is the picture I want you to focus on. This is a picture of culture. We could describe it, using modern computer terminology, as a kind of read-write culture. It's a culture where people participate in the creation and the recreation of their culture. In that sense, it's read-write. Sousa's fear was that we would lose that capacity because of these, quote, infernal machines. They would take it away. And in its place, we'd have the opposite of read-write culture, what we could call read-only culture. Culture where creativity was consumed, but the consumer is not a creator. A culture which is top-down, owned, where the vocal cords of the millions have been lost. Now, as you look back at the 20th century, at least in what we think of as the, quote, developed world, hard not to conclude that Sousa was right. Never before in the history of human culture had it been as professionalized, never before as concentrated, never before has creativity of the millions been as effectively displaced, and displaced because of these, quote, infernal machines. The 20th century was that century where, at least for those places we know best, culture moved from this read-write to read-only existence. So second, land is a kind of property. It's protected by law. As Lord Blackstone described it, land is protected by trespass law. For most of the history of trespass law, by presuming it protects the land all the way down below and to an indefinite extent upwards. That was a pretty good system for most of the history of the regulation of land until this technology came along. And people began to wonder, were these instruments trespassers as they flew over land without clearing the rights of the farms below as they traveled across the country? Well, in 1945, Supreme Court got a chance to address that question. 2 farmers, Thomas Lee and Teenie Cosby, who raised chickens, had a significant complaint because of these technologies. The complaint was that their chickens followed the pattern of the airplanes and flew themselves into the walls of the barn when the airplanes flew over the land. And so they appealed to Lord Blackstone to say these airplanes were trespassing. Since time immemorial, the law had said you can't fly over the land without permission of the landowner. So this flight must stop. Well, the Supreme Court considered this 100 years tradition and said, in an opinion written by Justice Douglas, that the Cosbys must lose. The Supreme Court said, the doctrine protecting land all the way to the sky has no place in the modern world. Otherwise, every transcontinental flight would subject the operator to countless trespass suits. Common sense, a rare idea in the law, but here it was. Common sense revolts at the idea. Common sense. Finally, before the internet, the last great terror to rain down on the content industry was a terror created by this technology, broadcasting. a new way to spread content, and therefore a new battle over the control of the businesses that would spread content. Now, at that time, the entity, the legal cartel that controlled the performance rights for most of the music that would be broadcast using these technologies was ASCAP. They had an exclusive license on the most popular content, and they exercised it in a way that tried to demonstrate to the broadcasters who really was in charge. So between 1931 and 1939, they raised rates by some 448%. Until the broadcasters finally got together and said, okay, enough of this. And in 1939, a lawyer, Sidney Kay, started something called Broadcast Music Incorporated. You know it as BMI. And BMI was much more democratic in the art that it would include within its repertoire, including African American music for the first time in the repertoire. But most important was that BMI took public domain works and made arrangements of them which they gave away for free to their subscribers. So that in 1940, when ASCAP threatened to double their rates, the majority of broadcasters switched to BMI. Now, ASCAP said they didn't care. The people will revolt, they predicted, because the very best music was no longer available because they had shifted to the second best public domain provided by BMI. Well, they didn't revolt. And in 1941, ASCAP cracked. And the important point to recognize is that even though these broadcasters were broadcasting something you would call second best, that competition was enough to break, at that time, this legal cartel over access to music. Okay, 3 stories. Here's the argument. In my view, the most significant thing to recognize about what this internet is doing is its opportunity to revive the read-write culture that Sousa romanticized. Digital technologies is the opportunity for the revival of these vocal cords that he spoke so passionately to Congress about. User-generated content, spreading in businesses in extraordinarily valuable ways like these, celebrating amateur culture, by which I don't mean amateurish culture. I mean culture where people produce for the love of what they're doing and not for the money. I mean the culture that your kids are producing all the time. For when you think of what Sousa romanticized in the young people together singing the songs of the day of the old songs, you should recognize what your kids are doing right now. Taking the songs of the day and the old songs and remixing them to make them something different. It's how they understand access to this culture. So let's have some very few examples. You get a